Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to welcome you to this international conference on multi-stakeholder action to address COVID-19 and its consequences. I'm Rudomar Bueno de Faria, the General Secretary of the ACT Alliance, a coalition of churches and church-based organizations working on humanitarian development and advocacy in more than 120 countries. We are proud of hosting this virtual conference to address one of the issues that are affecting our lives and reshaping societies and humanity. The current crisis the world is facing today is more than a health or epidemiological crisis. It has the potential to produce social, political, and economic devastations in countries that are already fragile and facing humanitarian crisis, armed conflict, poverty, and inequalities. The COVID pandemic came to and has surfaced the dysfunctionality of a normal that was already in crisis in most of our societies, especially the shocking and persistent discrimination such as racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and misogyny. We have also seen that this pandemic is creating a world that is less open and less free. It has placed humanity on a new and worrisome path. It is amplifying existing discrimination and inequalities, and it's also making the battle to leave no one behind much more difficult. The deepening inequality gaps brought about by the pandemic has profound implications for fundamental human rights. Threats related to climate change, shrinking space for civil society, populism, radical nationalism, and authoritarianism are still prevalent. And independent of the one's ideological and strategic entry point, it will be hard to believe that the world will be the same after the pandemic. All this makes innovative and effective partnership acute. It is essential and urgent for stakeholders to cooperate. As we enter in a unique window of opportunity to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being, we cannot ignore the opportunity for faith-based organizations offer insights to help and inform also future states of global relations and priorities of societies. The current pandemic forced us to be dependent on each other and create new partnerships with different stakeholders. The event of today aims at having different perspectives to respond to the immediate crisis, but also to shape the medium-term policy and action that will be needed post-crisis, including cross-sectoral cooperation. The event also aimed to analyzing the impact of COVID-19 on different dimensions of our lives and hint the best way to react as organizations, but also as humanity. This event will have two segments: a high-level sessions with distinguished guests from the United Nations, governments, corporate sector, and civil society, including multi-religious actors. And it will be distributed in 3 panels in an interview style and will be facilitated by moderators. The second segment will consist of breakout sessions between approximately 150 people from the same sectors: the UN, governments, corporate sector, and also civil society. And they will explore concrete ways and opportunities for multi-stakeholder action. And from the discussions in these groups, we expect to mobilize a collaborative response between faith-based and multilateral organizations, governments, and business. We expect to identify opportunities for investments and also funding on system-changing interventions from all stakeholders, as well as to generate COVID-related support for civil society and faith-based organizations around the world. In the first segment, we have the honor to count with the participation of UN Under-General Secretaries, namely Ms. Natalia Kanem, the Executive Director of the UN Population Fund, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Abdoulaye Mar Dieye, Assistant Secretary General and Senior Advisor to the UN Development Program. We also have government authorities with us today, namely Ms. Tine Rask Tiggensen, State Secretary for Development Policies at the Danish International Development Agency, and Minister of Social Development of the Kingdom of Jordan. In the last minute, he called us saying that he had to cancel his participation due to an urgent issue to address by request of the king in Jordan. And unfortunately, we will not be able to count also with the participation of Her Excellency Ms. Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil. Last week on Friday, she called me saying that she has an urgent matter and she cannot be with us at the time of this conference, but we could not change the time because of the panels that were coming after. But we also have in these segments, in the high-level segments, representatives from the corporate sector. Mr. Adrian Monk, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, and Mr. Rolf Mulder, the CEO and founder of Hospitainer from the Netherlands. And equally important, we have representatives from the civil society, including faith-based organizations. And I would like to highlight the participation of Ms. Amanda Mukawash, CEO of Christian Aid, Professor Dr. Asa Karam, Secretary General of Religions for Peace, and Reverend Dr. Thabo Makaboa, Archbishop of Cape Town and Metropolitan of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, and also Ms. Zaina Anwar, Director of Musawa from Malaysia.
How do I get to?
So these three blocks will be moderated by Mr. Peter Proof, who is the Director of the Commission of Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches, Ms. Bunny Dugal, Principal Representative of the Baha'i International Community to the United Nations, and Mr. Eric Lissen, Director of ACT Church of Sweden, based in Uppsala, Sweden. The closing remarks will be conducted by Mr. Birgit Chris Sorensen, the General Secretary of Dentures Aid, and also moderator of the ACT Alliance. The participants in the Zoom meeting and also in the breakout sessions have simultaneous interpretation into French, Spanish, and Portuguese. In the bottom bar of your screen, you have the option for selecting your desired language. Just click on the globe called Interpretation and choose the language. Welcome again, and let's start our discussions. I want to invite Mr. Peter Proof to kick off the high-level discussions. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Rudolmar, and thank you to ACT Alliance for convening this important event and bringing us all together. By way of housekeeping items, firstly, Rudolmar has already mentioned the interpretation facility, so please do select your most comfortable language in the bottom of your screen. But I also want to mention a very cool app that we're using to receive questions and comments from participants. It's called Slido. And it will be displayed on your screen, and there'll be some information and instructions given to you in the chat bar as well. It's via this app that we want you to pose your questions, but also to indicate your support for or your interest in questions that may have been posed by others. And that's important because at the end of each session, if time permits, we're going to look for the most liked questions on Slido and pose them to the panelists. So please take advantage of that facility. Now, if you're anything like me, this is going to be far from the first Zoom conference you've participated in on the pandemic and its impacts, but this one comes at a really pivotal moment, particularly in light of the news of 3 or 4 apparently efficacious vaccines in the pipeline, and the news just this morning that the United Kingdom has become the first country to actually approve one of these vaccines for rollout from as early as next week. So it is an appropriate moment for us to take a view of the impacts of this pandemic on our world, on our societies, on our people, and to look ahead to what might be coming next, what the next steps are, and what the world beyond the pandemic might look like. So this first panel session is under the title, The World Today and After COVID-19. And we have a stellar panel to help us take a view of that current and future reality. Rudelmar has already mentioned them, but I'll mention them again by name. Dr. Natalia Kanem, Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, Ms. Trine Rask-Tugesen, State Secretary for Development Policy at the Danish International Development Agency, DANIDA, Mr. Adrian Monk, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and Ms. Zaina Anwar, Director of Musawa and a founding member of Sisters in Islam. Now, because our time is so painfully short, less than 30 minutes for this important opening discussion, I've got a few reference questions that I'm going to pose all together, 4 of them. And then I'm going to revert to each of the panelists to give us a very brief initial intervention of 2 to 3 minutes, responding to any one of those questions, or indeed any other aspect of the current situation that they might feel particularly connected to. So the 4 questions are these. What are the key impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic today that are likely to be of lasting significance? And what key vulnerabilities has it exposed and exploited? The second question, what timeframes and challenges can we expect to face with regard to vaccine rollout and uptake? Third question, what role has social media played in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, for good or for ill, or both? And fourthly, might the Sustainable Development Goals have to be revised in light of the effects of the pandemic? So those are the 4 questions that have already been put to the panelists that I mentioned. And I'm going to go straight to the first panelist, Dr. Natalia Kanem, for her initial intervention. Dr. Kanem, the floor is yours.
Mil gracias, Peter, y también Rudelmar. I'm really delighted to be with you today. And I've prioritized this because faith-based communities are absolutely essential for the continuity of the family and for the transmission of those values of human dignity and human rights and love for one another that the United Nations Charter also espouses. When we think about COVID, people of faith who are always steadfast in defense of anyone in danger of being left behind, are going to be more and more called on with everything happening in the world today. And I believe that you're needed to stand up for women and girls now more than ever before. As many of you might know, the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, is the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. We're present in over 150 locations around the world, working with some of the poorest women and girls in the world. And our big dream is a dream of 0 by the year 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals come to fruition. 0 impediments to a woman planning her family at the pace that's right for her. 0 women dying while giving life. Although in this short 24 hours today, 800 pregnant women in this world will die from totally preventable causes. And UNFPA also says 0 to gender-based violence, which brings me right back to COVID, because despite global commitments, women still lack reproductive health services and their rights continue to be violated. And it's worse yet, and Rudelmar alluded to this, for people who are indigenous or women and girls of African descent, or anyone living with a disability, an elderly woman. And those disparities do have a devastating and a lasting impact. Right now, if you're a woman or a girl trapped in an abusive situation because of COVID movement restrictions and you can't run because of the police roadblock down the road, what are you going to do? Since COVID restrictions began, for every 3 months of lockdown situations, 15 million additional cases of gender-based violence. That's the estimate of what's occurring. And these women are being hurt and traumatized and even murdered. It's a secondary pandemic within the pandemic. And this COVID pandemic is unprecedented. It's daunting when you think of the health and the socioeconomic and the humanitarian consequences. With program disruptions, I am hearing that more girls home from school are being married off. More girls home from school are being subjected to female genital mutilation. We are actually anticipating an extra 2 million cases of FGM by the end of 2030. And as always, it seems to be the poorest women who have the fewest options to escape the trauma of a violent household to get that compassionate healing and counseling that they're going to need to recover. Quality data is something that this epidemic is showing us is important, and that's how the health system, well organized, makes a difference. For UNFPA, our experts are providing disaggregated data by age, by gender, by location, census by census, country by country. And why am I saying that engagement of the faith-based community is more important with COVID than ever before? Because you're the ones that can touch people's hearts and move minds towards action. Enough talk. It's broad coalitions, it's combined expertise. That's how we're going to redress the tremendous fragilities that women and girls contend with today. So just to close up, your outspoken moral leadership today in unequivocally denouncing wrongdoing like gender-based violence, this is a huge factor in preventing domestic violence and protecting the rights of women and girls. And I would like to publicly commend the 100+ partners of the ACT Alliance for embracing the ICPD program of action. It's an agenda with immense benefits for women and girls. And a heartfelt thanks, because when you reach the hearts and minds of these communities, it's as a trusted source of information. And disinformation is another problem right now. So as we give comfort and guidance in the intimacy of the family, I am asking you to promote evidence and science-based approaches to COVID, and to advocate for an equitable distribution of vaccines, as our Secretary General has said. So ultimately, I think we will be able to have that PPE for the nurses and midwives to create the logistics and the supply chains that we need to meet the most vulnerable with this vaccine once it's available. So thank you for cultivating compassion, working with religious groups and with traditional leaders. I have personally learned so much about how culture can change, about how we can work together to end stigma and discrimination. So thank you for your closeness to communities and keeping up the faith. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanem, and thanks for that encouragement as well. I think we all take it to heart, those of us in the faith sector. Now, I know that I'm going to flip the order here a little bit, because I know that Ms. Anwar is also keen to speak about the gendered impacts of COVID-19. So I'm going to ask Ms. Anwar if she'd like to make her intervention, her opening intervention now for 3 minutes.
Good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really want to focus on the gendered impact of the pandemic, because it's really spotlighted the high price of ignoring systemic discrimination in the family, the legal framework that underpins family laws today, and how this then shapes women's status, rights, or lack of roles and responsibilities within the family, especially family laws that are based on religion, culture, and tradition. All the evidence points to the reality that without equality in the private sphere of the family, there can be no equality for women in the public sphere. What this pandemic has highlighted is how systemic inequalities in the family have led to higher rates of domestic and intimate partner violence that Dr. Kanem had referred to, increased care burdens on women, increased financial vulnerabilities for women under country lockdowns, and exacerbated online gender-based violence. I mean, the list just goes on. So for me, as the world undergoes major political, economic, and public health upheavals, solutions must be found for the gross inequalities and injustices that exist today. It simply cannot be business as usual. And it is no time to, once again, place women's issues on the back burner because there are more other important issues. Now more than ever is the time to urgently address centuries-old discrimination against women as we build back a better world. Musawa, the group that I lead today, has just launched our campaign for justice in Muslim family laws. And we're also linking up with another global campaign for equality in family law with UN Women as a strategic partner, which brings together women's groups working on the issue of discrimination against women in the family across all religions, culture, and tradition. We see this global mobilization and organizing and the issues we are raising and the solutions we are demanding as integral to the global discussion today on ending the deeply intertwined systemic inequalities and injustices of this world. We are demanding our right to be heard at the national, regional, and global levels, our right to shape how our religion is understood and used as a source of law, policy, and practice that in many ways continue to discriminate against women in the private and public spheres. Women simply will not wait anymore. In this time of crisis, more than ever, is the time for justice, for equality, for respect, and recognition that women are human beings of equal worth and dignity. Understanding that is not rocket science. It is basic humanity. This dysfunction in the most basic unit of society must stop. For me, God cannot be God if God is unjust. It is as simple as that. And to use God to continue to justify the discrimination of half the human race is outrageous. It is time that all of us who believe in God, who belong to faith-based organization, confront this elephant in the room and join women's rights activists who are working with many progressive scholars of religion today in our effort to reconcile religion and rights. Equality in the family cannot wait. Justice for women and girls cannot wait. Equality and justice for all cannot wait anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zaina. That's a very, very clear call, very specific. So let me now call on Ms. Trina Rask-Tigerson, State Secretary for Development Policy at Danida, for her intervention. 3 minutes, Ms. Tigerson.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to ACT for inviting me to speak here. I was very honored when Birgitte called me and told about this high-level panel, and not this, at least this important group of partners of us. So just one comment, and that goes back to ACT Alliance and other organizations like you. When we from the Danish side in March, April had a lockdown in our own societies and started hearing from you, our partners that are out there in the front line, basically where it's all supposed to happen, getting information, this was definitely a health and a humanitarian crisis, but also very soon it turned out to be a food crisis, a socio-economic crisis, a democratic rights, civil society crisis. Again, like our two honored former speakers here said, very much the worst situation was for girls and women. We've seen that all along. From the Danish side, our reaction was trying to keep our own programs going and then giving max flexibility to our partners, you that are working out there in the field. So basically, we have been able to keep all our support going. We hear, and that's a huge praise to all of you, that our partners kept working out there. We said this will be a max flexibility from our side to change the way you work, change focus in programs. So for an example is we have a fairly big program in the agricultural sector in Uganda. In a period of time in June, July, our what can you say, farmers that were training farmers, they had been trained in assisting WFP in handing out food instead. So going in, basically trusting our partners, you out there, and giving you max flexibility, both in terms of spacing, of disbursements and so on, and in terms of the way you were working, because you are out there and you could sense the need the most. And I must admit, I think it's that's what actually gives hope in this situation, is that so many activities have been going on. So many of your local staff and partners have been able still to work in this situation. And that's what we need to focus on. So also a comment back to the question about what will, and that's the positive I will take with me from the COVID-19. We can do this differently and perhaps much more flexible and agile than what we used to. And I think we should keep that in mind when we move ahead, because we will need it, because the crisis is deepening. And again, Natalie and Serenia spoke so well about women's and girls' rights. Denmark will, from the 1st of January, be taking on the global leadership of the call to action on protection of gender-based violence in emergencies. This is a key priority for us, and we trust that you partners will be with us on this one. We will also be focusing more on the shrinking civic space that we see, unfortunately now, are leading to very many human rights violations. So we'll also have a special focus there. And basically, our concern is that the COVID-19 pandemic is just deepening the crisis. And if you look at the issue of the SDGs, for us, this is absolutely still the best option. And we don't see a need to change them. We see a huge need to implement them. And we actually think this crisis has shown us two major things that are at the core of the SDGs, and that is leaving no one behind. This is also an inequality crisis that we see are being played out now. And then it's definitely about the interlinkage between the different SDGs. So what I said in the beginning, that this started out as a health crisis, but it definitely have turned into a hunger crisis, basically many places, socioeconomic, human rights crisis. So it all goes together, and that's also what we need to start building up again. And I'm really curious also to get the feedback from this conference, because I think you have a lot of the solutions, how we can do it even better. And I think we have learned something about flexibility and the ability to adapt in a situation like this. And I think also you partners should challenge us donors to keep that focus on flexibility, because when we could do it in an emergency based on trust in partners, taking risks. Sometimes we need to be able to take risks to reach the most vulnerable. Then we can also do it when it's not in an acute COVID-19 crisis. So I'll send that back to the participants and the panelists, also an invitation to challenge us on the donor side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tiggerson, for that invitation. I can assure you it'll be taken up with great enthusiasm. And thank you also for the optimistic assessment of the SDG timeline and goals, despite the very, very heavy impacts of the pandemic. Now, I've been informed that there are still no questions that have been lodged on Slido, and I really can't believe that can be the case. I'm sure you must have questions that you would like to share, but before we come to those questions, I just wanted to give you a heads up so that you can make use of that facility, because we have another panelist, Mr. Adrian Monk, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum. Adrian has also received the questions that have been posed and has reflected on them, and I'm sure he will bring some additional angles to this snapshot that we're trying to take about the current state of our world under the pandemic and the next steps going forward. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that, Peter, and thanks to the previous panelists for the important interventions that they made. Look, I mean, you've heard from people the devastating impact. You can probably, all of you, see for yourselves the huge effect this crisis has had on the people you work with and work amongst. We've seen it here in Geneva in the work the Forum does, supporting businesses, supporting governments, supporting other organizations like the WHO. But I think if we all take a step backwards, I think we can look at this with a degree of hope. Because if you look at the activity that's been devoted to tackling this crisis from the public sector, from the private sector, from science, I think we've seen a mobilization that previously human beings have only reserved in pursuit of killing one another. We've had a wartime mobilization across the globe. And I think that is a moment in the history of this planet when, for once, it hasn't been the motivation of harming other people, doing each other in, that's brought us together to actually collaborate, cooperate, and try and solve something. It's something that concerns all of us and affects all of us. And I think, especially as faith communities, it gives strength, hope, and vision that there is something that we can do, and that there are expectations we can have of decision makers, of governments, of people with power, that they used to tell us they couldn't do. We used to hear that we couldn't shut down aviation. We used to hear that we couldn't ask people to behave responsibly and stay at home because people needed more guidance. They wouldn't behave themselves. We've seen around the world that people have responded in magnificent, extraordinary ways to this, both in research labs, on streets, helping neighbors, in ways that I think few people could have predicted. And I think we have to look at this crisis as an opportunity to draw strength and optimism as we look at what we face coming down the line, because it's not just this crisis. The crises that we face as a planet are climate change, they're inequality, they're issues of distribution. There are huge planet-wide issues that we will all be involved in tackling. And I think if this pandemic leaves us with one key reflection, it's that we can make a difference and we can mobilize together to get things done if we have the will and if we see the need. And I think especially when it comes to seeing the need and having the will, that's where all of you can come in, because you are people who have that passion, who have that vision, who have that will. And I think it's going to be absolutely vital in the months and the years ahead that you bring that not just to dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, but also to these other enormous issues that we need as a world to tackle. So from Geneva, that's my reflection. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Indeed, I think that's a very, very important observation, this unprecedented mobilization for a non-conflictual purpose. And I think that is something that we must draw on. It does strike me that in some ways this pandemic has thrown into sharper relief some of the maybe less visible inequalities and challenges that have pre-existed the pandemic, and that's helpful in terms of our next steps. But it's also hidden or diverted attention from other pressing crises, in particular the climate crisis. And so I think it's good that we see the possibility of a light at the end of the tunnel, a turning point that will enable us to go back to those equally pressing emergencies. Now, I understand that we have now 2 questions lodged on Slido. So to honor those who put those questions up there, let's have a look at them. How can we address the gap between the goal of building back better and the lack of political will to address meaningfully the most pressing issues we face? Very, very related to what we were just discussing, Adrian. And to Dr. Natalia and Ms. Zena Anwar, could you give practical examples where faith-based organizations are partners provoking changes in norms and traditions, improving gender justice? And now I see this is a third question just popped up. No, sorry, I see they've just been reordered in terms of likes. Okay, so there are 2 questions before us. They're on your screen. I'm going back to the 4 panelists now and opening the floor for anybody who would like to respond to one or the other of those questions. Who would like to start? Please just jump in.
If I can answer that question on the role of faith-based partners. Yeah, I mean, if I can just share what the women's groups are doing in the Muslim world. I mean, there's really an amazing exponential growth in rights-based scholarship in Islam. Working with women's groups are working with religious scholars and religious leaders to really, challenge the dominant narrative in the Muslim world that women are inferior to men, that men are the providers and protectors, and really, trying to bring about an alternative public discourse on the issue of gender justice, of rights and equality that is possible in the Muslim tradition. And we're doing this, in terms of knowledge production, new feminist rights-based knowledge in Islam. We're training women's rights activists and policymakers in the Muslim world on the possibility of arguing for equality, for justice, for reform in these discriminatory laws that are based on religion. We're intervening in the UN processes, in the CEDAW process, especially in Geneva, where we basically submit thematic reports reports, challenging the ways many governments of Muslim majority countries that use Islam to justify non-compliance with their treaty obligations. So this incredible knowledge that has been built is now being used together, in this joining hands between religious scholars, progressive religious scholars and activists on the ground who want to see change. And I think this is really making a difference in terms of the state of the debate on Islam and women's rights, on the possibility of reconciling religion and rights at international platforms like the CEDAW constructive engagement process, and in different platforms that we hope the global campaign that we're about to embark is going to open up this space even more and really galvanize global attention and shape public opinion and support towards equality and justice in Islam and in religions and cultures and tradition. That there is this contestation now, that's taking place, and that we, of course, we plan and we hope that our voice, the voice of justice, of equality, of the possibility of reform, will in the end prevail to change what is currently a dominant conservative voice that does not recognize equality.
Thank you, Zena. Yes, we've just got a few minutes left. I want to maybe shoot the second question in Adrian's direction. The gap between the even more evident need to build back better and the lack of political will. I'm sure you've had many reflections on this at the forum, but do you have an answer? That would be great.
I wish we did have an answer, Peter, because it is something I think that a lot of people are concerned about when they look at the governmental responses. But I think I'd go back to a little bit to what I said earlier, which is I think that sometimes politicians need to be reminded of the political will they've shown, and that we need to remind them, because actually they've done things that they've always told us they couldn't do before. They've taken actions that they previously said were completely off the table. And I think one of the things to do when we think about looking forward and about making the most of the incredible sacrifices people have made and the incredible contributions people have delivered into tackling this crisis is actually not to ignore the contributions made at the political level by political leadership. Political leadership's been incredibly challenged by this crisis, and people have been put into situations they couldn't possibly have imagined having to deal with. And I think, given successes and failures, to a person, they have responded with the best efforts they could make. And in showing those efforts, they've shown us that they can do more. And I think holding people to that standard is going to be really vital when it comes to looking at that, but building back better scenario that we'd all like to see. Because if we remind people of what they've been able to achieve in the current crisis, then I think we stand a good opportunity of holding them to that standard when we face other challenges and other crises in the years ahead.
Excellent point. Thank you very much, Adrian. Now I'm going to revert to the other two panelists for a final word in the 2 minutes that remain. Trina, do you have a further reflection in the light of this discussion thus far?
Just a quick comment also on the building back better and the commitments. I think from our side, the whole importance about building back better and greener. So definitely keeping the focus on the green initiatives and the climate initiatives. I think in the longer term, this is a huge, what can you say, health disaster, socioeconomic disaster, and so on. But in the longer term, the climate crisis is a much huger crisis for all of us. So already now starting to think in more long term and thinking in terms of climate as well. And by the way, it's also the most vulnerable women and girls and so on that are being hit by the climate crisis. So for us trying to get this in also in our emergency and acute response now, I think is absolutely key. And that's also very much to you partners, again, local based solutions that are so effective. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Natalia, you have the last word.
Well, thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. It's clear that women, who in fact are slightly half of the world's population, are not sitting back and waiting. And I think the religious groups who have come forth were visible in Nairobi, where commitments were made to turn promises made into promises kept on things like female genital mutilation, where faith-based organizations are actually leading in countries like Kenya, in West Africa, in Indonesia, in order to quell FGM. Leaders of faith groups have also given selfless, anonymous service by way of women who suffer from obstetric fistula, a calamity of labor that's unattended. In Nairobi, it was the Bishop of Sweden and an imam and so many others who in that closing ceremony inspired us to understand that we have to hold hands. And that means that young people have to be sensitized to gender from an early age. So the church-based groups are actually helping me and UNFPA to translate the need for young people at an age-appropriate time to sensitively understand their sexuality. This is something where faith-based groups need to lead because, as we've all said in our discussion, you can penetrate communities and people have faith in you. So ultimately, my belief that culture can change has been proven when I stand with a traditional leader from Niger who is saying to his public in his village that family planning so our women don't die in childbirth is good. This is an example of the leadership that I think we've all said. And my only last plea is that we also fund local women-led organizations because they usually are the arbiters of what happens in the family. And so in humanitarian settings and in development settings, I'm just asking people to pay attention to that as well. Thank you. It's been exciting being with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalia, and thank you to all the panelists who have achieved a small miracle of giving us actually quite a powerful snapshot of where we are and where we're going in the brief space of 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Our time is up and we move on to the next segment.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Bani Dougal, and I'm representative of the Baha'i International Community to the United Nations. We are now moving into session 2, which is multi-stakeholder action. After decades of globalization and integration, the world is witnessing a retreat from multilateralism, united action, and in many cases, a return to unilateral actions and rising nationalism in all regions. This is testing the commitments to treaty obligations and support for multilateral institutions. Civil society space is shrinking at national and global levels, and public health and security issues are often used as an excuse to restrict and/or deny human rights. As long as the call for unity remains unheeded, the world's current state of disorder and degradation will worsen, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take a significant step towards constructive change. However, the COVID pandemic has also illustrated that global problems can only be resolved through solutions that are based on multilateral and multi-stakeholder cooperation. And there are reasons to hope and remain optimistic. In the first session, we heard Adrian Monk's plea on turning crisis into opportunities. And who better than faith actors to show us the way? In this session, we will explore some of the questions on how we can facilitate cross-sector and regional dialogues and build back stronger post-pandemic, and also how we can build diverse partnerships, including with civil society and faith actors, and involve communities and social movements in designing and implementing these approaches. So we have a wonderful panel of speakers. Mr. Abdoulaye Mardie, who is the Assistant Secretary General at the UN and Senior Advisor to the UNDP Administrator. Ms. Amanda Khosi Mkhwashi, CEO of Christian Aid. And Mr. Roloff Mulder, CEO and founder of Hospitana. So like the first panel, I'm going to pose a few questions, one to each of our speakers, And then I have a fourth question for all of them. And if time permits, we'll also get some of the questions from Slido. I believe you've all figured out how to use it. So we look forward to getting those questions from you. So my first question, I turn to Mr. Mardier. Throughout history, periods of turbulence have presented opportunities to redefine collective values and the assumptions that underlie them. How can we learn from past experiences to refashion all levels of governance to reflect our growing global interdependence and to foster equality and equity as a primary social objective and not merely a welcomed co-benefit?
Greeting Bunny, and greetings colleagues. And really, let me first express my greatest appreciation to the previous panel. I was listening, it was quite fascinating, and I could capture the energy of that panel. So if you would allow me, before I answer your question, I wanted to plug into that energy that would guide me. And hence, I would like to preamble by saying that what I heard the first panel was saying, remind me the inspiration and guidance I always get from the teachings of Don Juan in the Yaqui way of knowledge, as revealed by Carlos Castaneda. For that Indian healer, Don Juan, when you are troubled outside, you must go inwards. And that's the only way forward. Inwards, you will find the source, the unique source, where we are all connected, and where we are all one. In fact, COVID-19, the trouble to the world, is a painful reminder that we have deviated from the source, and we have ignored its teachings by abusing our own selves, by abusing our societies, and by abusing our planet. If we were just to realize that and act with humility and solidarity, we will understand, as Albert Camus eloquently put it, that in the depth of winter, there lay within us an invincible summer. We can indeed reset our world, avoid the dark winter of COVID, and reach that invincible summer. But we need the power of faith, faith in the source, faith that we are all connected, and faith that we are all one. Hence the criticality of the work you are doing in ACT Alliance, and the United Nations wanted to salute that, and I would like to renew our partnership. Coming to your excellent question, it is true that equality and equity are imperatives that's for a stable and prosperous society. But I do not believe that they are a primary social objective as it is inferred in the question. They are resultant of a more powerful and ontological one, which is justice. And I would like to echo the powerful message of Zaina Anwar earlier, when she said in The Planet that justice is at the heart of it. And I believe, like Hegel and John Rawls, that I believe in the primacy of justice, of rights, of moral. Unless we deliver justice nationally and internationally, we will not, I repeat, not build lasting peace and prosperity. In the Torah, in the book of Exodus, it is said, justice, justice shall you pursue. In the Bible, in Isaiah, it said, for the Lord is a God of justice. And the Quran in Surah An-Nahl, the B, says, O you who believe, be persistently standing firm in justice. The true essence of justice is to aim at establishing balance among powers and societal order. Justice, fair and accountable justice, is the litmus test for the well-being of the community. It is the matrix of governance. Hence, to answer your question, to redefine collective values, we must bring greater inclusion in both international, political, and financial governance. When we come to the discussion, I will elaborate more. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mardiai. for that reminder. Justice is at the basis of my faith tradition as well. And we can have no unity and equity in the world without justice. So thank you. We now turn to Ms. Amanda Jose Mukwashi, CEO of Christian Aid. And my question to you, Amanda, is the COVID-19 crisis and the political, economic, and social disruptions it has caused is fundamentally changing the traditional context for global governance and decision-making. No longer can any one sector be solely responsible, requiring a collaborative response by all stakeholders. So as we enter a unique window of opportunity to tackle what is being called the Great Reset, how do you propose to collaborate with all stakeholders to build a better, more inclusive and equal world, which reflects the oneness of humanity?
Thank you very much, Bunny. And wow, what a big question, I think. So first of all, let me just quickly say thank you so much for having me on this panel. And like the previous speaker, I would also like to say I was really energized and motivated by the first panel. I think that to answer your question, I would probably have to say, first of all, I would like to consider, has the nature of collaboration changed? So what can we continue? Because we've been talking about multi-stakeholder collaborations for quite a long time. We've been talking, when we look at the SDGs, partnership is at the heart of the SDGs. We talk about working together. We talk about working with civil society, private sector. So what has changed? I think that's where I want to start from. So a few things that I just want to throw in there, and then afterwards, if there's time for discussion, we can do that. The first is in terms of COVID-related change. We've heard quite a lot already, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But one, COVID has exposed pre-existing fault lines, right? And you can have an entire list. The three that I want to flag up is inequalities, gender, for example, on issues of gender-based violence, we've heard quite a lot of that, and racial injustice. Mara has just been talking about the centering around justice. So those are some of the fault lines that have been exposed. The second thing that I think I want to say around COVID is that there's been a reversal of development gains. We have seen where we had made a lot of progress, and we had made quite a lot of progress around education, around health, around, all that has been reversed. And it's not just in terms of development, it's also in terms of rights, right? Including civil society shrinking the space. And then the last bit that I want to say that's related to COVID is something that we don't normally talk about, but that is so important in moving forward in terms of in terms of collaboration. What we saw during COVID was what I would call the limited ability of the international system to come in and respond fast, effectively, and efficiently at a time when we were not able to actually travel, right? And so our dependency on local responses was really highlighted. And let's just remember this, because in terms of solutions for the future, in terms of how we collaborate, I think that sits right at the heart of how we do that. The second thing that I want to say is non-COVID related. These COVID-related issues or assumptions came at the back of two other things. One, the financial architecture that we work in, right? And when I'm talking about the financial architecture, of course, it's much broader in terms of macroeconomics. But from a Christian Aid perspective, I really want to zero in on the issue of debt and the issue of tax avoidance. When you look at debt, for example, what you see is a shift, significant shift on who holds the debt for the poorest countries. It's private creditors, and private creditors appear to be above the law. So in terms of governance of debt, that is something that is quite a big thing. And then the last thing, sorry, I hope I won't take a lot more of your time, climate change. I think the issue of climate change, that's the biggest backdrop for us. Because within the issue of climate change, there's also embedded in that the issue of injustice, especially when it comes to who is suffering the consequences of that, and also the issue of loss and damage. So that's my background, and therefore my response to you is very brief, right? How do I propose to collaborate with all stakeholders? I think that all these things, the way we've operated in terms of the economic, the political, and social, has been based on a set of values and assumptions that are no longer fit for purpose. Those values and assumptions are survival of the fittest. Assumptions that economic growth is necessarily going to translate into a fair redistribution of wealth, and we know that it doesn't. Women, Black people, brown people are at the bottom of that food chain. Mm. So therefore, for me, how I propose to move forward is, let's go back to the values that we articulated in the Human Rights Declaration, the values of dignity, the values of equality, of fairness, of independence. Those values, we are far away from living out those values. And, you know, I mean, really, I wanted to respond to quite a bit, but I know that time is not with me. For Christian Aid, we look at poverty, power, and prophetic voice. And so in responding, in terms of collaborating, we need to put communities, local resilience at the heart. And I heard a previous speaker who said that governments are willing to do this. We've seen them try and do something. Well, I would say that, you know what? I'm sorry, they haven't done enough. What we've seen is just not good enough. Faith actors, yes, we are there, we're in the communities. Women's organizations are in the communities, youth organizations are in the communities, but even faith actors, we have not done enough. We can do more. And therefore, we need to restore the right values to be the centerpiece and the axis of any future collaboration. Mm. Only then can we see a difference for the world's poorest people. In fact, for all of us, because we're one chain, right? And we're only as strong as our weakest link. And the weakest among us has to be able to be resilient and to be able to overcome on their own and in partnership and solidarity with others. Shall I stop there, Bunny? I know I've taken quite a lot of time. And then-
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda. It was a big question, but you answered it briefly, but so completely. So thank you. And I agree, we really do need to make you know, the individuals that are suffering part of, you know, help them to be the part of the solution and protagonists in their own development. So thank you for all those good points. We now turn to Mr. Roloff Mulder, who is the CEO and founder of Hospitana. Roloff, to you, I ask the question, since COVID has exacerbated inequalities within and among developed and developing nations that are associated with economic instability, corruption, financial crisis, gender inequality, high crime, poor physical and mental health. How can these fractures be mended through a well thought out and collaborative multi-stakeholder action? So it's good that this question is following Amanda's answer, because I think she sort of set the frame, but we look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Mulder.
Yes, thank you so much, Bani, for inviting me. Let me start with how can we work together as multi-stakeholders. I'm from the private sector. We're a social enterprise. We work with NGOs, with governments. We are strategic partner of UNFPA and UN OCHA. So we always try to combine the different stakeholders where we are and do it also from a sustainable perspective, that it's that we're not depending only on donations. And we try to do that right now with the Preparedness Hub, especially when we're talking about COVID right now. We deliver a lot of COVID clinics, actually 20 in the last period, and PCR labs, etc. And in the whole, right now, we are sending 4 to Italy and 1 to Lesbos that was burned down because of the fire there. So we are very active with the local actors, but we see that we need to be more prepared. That has the lesson been from COVID, that we all, like Amanda says, there's not enough local response. We need more local response. So we need to work together in different areas in the world and start, we call it preparedness hubs, where we have the facilities available, clinics, laboratories, OTs, for instance, that quickly can be put in place with the local stakeholders. And we try to set up right now such a cooperation with NGOs. Also, our government will support it, impact investors. We're also discussing this right now with ACT, and how can we work with the different actors to set up these hubs so that we can respond very quickly. And from there, this always start, but then you need to work together with the local stakeholders. And for instance, we call it healthy village. We start with a clinic in a village, and then around it we start to build the water, the energy, education, food production, because patients also need good food. It's an example from the farmers in the area. So we try to collaborate with all the NGOs, government in the area. And we also have a model, we call it the franchise model, where also the private initiative is encouraged, but also we also try to protect the interests of the, let's say, the weaker communities. Otherwise you get the cherry picking, etc. So there's a model of having preparedness hubs, giving quick access to healthcare, and from there develop the whole region or the whole village as a healthy village. So this is the setup, and we very much would like to start with it. We already have started, but also now this, while we're talking here together, I would say let's join hands and combine all the strengths that we have. Thank you.
This is a wonderful example, Rolf, of how we can have an inclusive process of recovery so that all those that are impacted by the policies can be protagonists in their own recovery, in a sense. Something that Amanda also referenced. So I'm going to pose a fourth question until we hear from the Slido as to the questions we are hearing from our participants. But my question to, I'll go back to Mr. Abdoulaye Mardié. Oftentimes we see policies being drafted by a small exclusive group of experts, and then civil society, faith actors, and other stakeholders are asked to implement them. So how do you think we can change this so that we can have a more inclusive process of the recovery?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Bani. In fact, and it did transpire in the discussion we had a little bit earlier, orthodox and conventional policy design, policy making, and policy debates, they are part of the problem. For me, they carry three fundamental fallacies. Fallacy number one is that they're always conducted in terms of absolutes. It's A or B, it's right or wrong. That's false for me. The second fallacy is that they are framed in prescriptive and deductive fashion. If A, then B. And hence they are victims of what we call in the jargon of policymaking, causal interference trap. So that's a big mistake. The third fallacy for me, which is a drama, they often ignore behavioral sciences and insight. They ignore that context matters, be they geographical, historical, including the historical legacy we're seeing in the racism debate, or political or cultural context. And that we human beings, we are not just driven by stimulus or incentives. We are soul beings and real agents of change. They always see us as beneficiaries. We are not beneficiaries. It's an agency matter. So if we want to reset our world on a sustainable track, I believe we have to reinvent policy making and make them more inductive than deductive, more inclusive than just prescriptive. This is what UNDP is trying to do with what we call the accelerator labs, a little bit on the line of what Roloff said earlier. We are operating now in 114 countries where we applied the principle of going from the governance of shareholders to the governance of stakeholders. The principle that all shareholders have to be around the decision-making table. Unless we do that, we will still be in the situation of elite capture of the social contract. We have to deconstruct that by bringing all stakeholders around the table. And we have seen it. And in the earlier discussion, I remember what Natalia was saying. When we want to ensure that policy has more impact, sometimes it's better done with faith leaders than with government. So if you don't involve them, you won't have a dent and impact on society. So reinventing, turning around the way of doing policy making, for me, has to be put on the table. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I believe we have a couple of questions on the Slido portal. If you'd put them up. Wonderful. Oh, there's more than a couple. So my friend Andrew Tomlinson from CUNO has asked, how can we more effectively align crisis response with longer-term efforts to foster peace, justice, and inclusion, a central aspiration of the 2030 agenda? And I think we can only take two. The second question is from Luisa Kislinger from IPPF Western Hemisphere region. How can we collectively respond when public health measures are used to restrict and deny the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls? So let's take these two, and just a minute or 30 seconds each. Speaker, who would like to begin? Roloff.
Yes, can I answer the first question?
Please.
When it comes to peace, for instance, we work a lot in Syria during the war, and we work with local monastery. And we see that bringing healthcare stopped fighting between two parties, because the clinic was set just in between. And they made an agreement that parties from both sides could go there to get healthcare. And you see the active role of the church, also the Sunnis, the Shiites, the church, all the leaders, they decided this together. So you see that bringing healthcare can really help bringing peace as well.
Thank you so much. Anyone care to pick up on the second question around sexual reproductive health?
Yes, I think if it's okay, there are a number of questions there that would have been good for us to just cover, but I hope my response will cut across not just Louisa's question. I think we talked about the fact that, we're seeing restrictions in not just in civil society space, but also in services to women, and that they're being impacted on. We are seeing cuts in budgets for support of development aid. And so right across, we are seeing this withdrawal from this collaboration. And not only that, we're seeing a move towards what we call national interests rather than the interests of all of us as humanity. So three things that I'm going to say, at least this is our approach at Christian Aid, and that's all I can offer at this point. I talked about the 3 Ps: poverty, localized approaches. Please, let's revisit what we mean when we talk about capacity strengthening, right? Capacity strengthening has to be much more than just giving, some money. It is really, if we are not leaving communities much stronger and much better off, then we're failing in what we're doing. So let's commit to that. Power. Let's recognize that, yes, and I know that people will think that I'm anti-capitalist, but let's recognize that the capitalist model as it is has not been able to deliver for everybody. And therefore, there has to be some intentionality to changing this model. Only recently, a survey that was done by The Guardian shows that as governments are preparing to kickstart their economies, they're going back to fossil fuels, right? They're going back to fossil fuels. So let's rethink how we do that. And then the last one, and this is for my colleagues in faith-based organizations, our prophetic voice is really important. How can we collaborate and mobilize together to speak truth to power, right? And speaking truth to power doesn't mean that, we're criticizing private sector or we're criticizing governments and we're being unhelpful. Speaking truth to power is saying these policies, these actions and these decisions and the choices that we're making, they're not human-centered. They're causing more injustice and more harm. We can, and I know, Bani, there are some good things that are happening out there, and we would have had an opportunity to talk about them and to flag them. But at the moment, the bottom billion is still being left out. The people bearing the brunt of some of the choices are people who we have not brought their voice and agency to the table. And we need to take the conversation to them. When we are looking for votes, we are able to go out into every household, right? Well, you know what? When we are designing programs, can we do the same? We have the ability
Thank you
to
so
do
much,
it.
Amanda. This is a perfect segue to the next section. And because the third panel is going to address the role of faith-based organizations. So I turn it over now to the moderator, Eric Lyson.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you all. Very interesting panel sessions already, and we have already touched on that particular issue, the role of faith-based organizations. It's really been interesting to follow all the conversations we've had so far. Before I will just have a brief introduction and introduce our distinguished panelists, just to say a few practical things again. Remember the Slido with the questions, and remember at the bottom of the screen as well that you have language interpretation. So make use of that. The world, as we've seen already, and we talked about it, is predominantly religious. Faith and beliefs influence policies and practices and guides norms and values and informs people's action. If we want to change behavior and norms, we need to work with faith leaders and communities. Norms can rarely be changed from the outside. Community-based actions often empower people and strengthen the social fabric. Local communities are always the first responders in humanitarian action or in responding to diseases. Churches, mosques, and temples are often the local hub and are present before, during, and after a crisis. In many countries, faith-based organizations are responsible for providing a significant part of health services, especially in underserved and marginalized communities. Faith communities and faith-related organizations are also active at the national level with a prophetic voice, as Amanda Mukasha was talking about, in advocacy for inclusive social policies, democratic accountability, and human rights. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some local faith groups have openly challenged public health policies. Yet at the same time, we have seen many faith actors stepping up to the occasion, both in terms of services and support and working with faith communities to promote evidence-based healthcare information and safe practices. So with this introduction, I would like to present my distinguished guests that will share their thoughts and perspectives on this topic. First of all, let me introduce Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and formerly, of course, the President of Chile on 2 occasions. We are very pleased that you were able to set aside of your valuable time to be part of this panel. Secondly, Professor Dr. Asa Karam, who is currently the Secretary General of Religions for Peace International, and also Professor of Religion and Development at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Professor Karam has also served as a senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund. And finally, let me introduce to you Most Reverend Dr. Thabo Makgoba, Archbishop of Cape Town and Metropolitan of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. Most Reverend Thabo Makgoba is also the former chair of the Anglican Communion Environmental Network. And then, as Rudolmar said at the very beginning, one of the panelists, His Excellency Mr. Ayman Riyad Al Mufleh, who's the Minister of Social Development in Jordan, had to pull out last night because of other pressing priorities. So, let's start the conversation. I've asked the panelists to reflect on what role from their own experiences faith-based organizations have played during the pandemic, and in that context, highlight some shortcomings and success stories. And I will ask the High Commissioner Bachelet to start, and then we continue with Dr. Assa Karam and then Archbishop Makova. Please, Michelle Bachelet, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I want to thank ACT Alliance for this timely opportunity, I think, to compare notes and draw lessons from our various experiences in trying to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on people's lives across the world. And it's very common to say that crises always carry lessons to learn, but also opportunities for change. And from our perspective as UN Human Rights Office, the current crisis has been an eye-opener in many ways. I mean, not only has laid bare all the inequalities that are there in the world, I mean, I knew that many times, many years ago, but for many people, it has been for the first time they are realizing that. But the world has also now seen beyond doubt how fragile economies are, and also how interrelated are our interests too. So, of course, I'm not going to say nothing very new, but global problems need global approaches, and exceptional challenges need unprecedented solutions. I think the second major finding from our current crisis relates to, and I think I was listening to the other panel, and it's in the idea that Amanda was mentioning, that is so important empowering grassroots civil society actors. Because when travel stops and movement is restricted due to pandemic, we rediscover how vital the role of grassroots actors are. In fact, the role is always crucial, and we simply tend not to sufficiently appreciate them in normal times. And faith-based organizations are one of the non-state actors who are nearest to the people. They are particularly close to the most needy and vulnerable. And the current crisis is one of public health that requires awareness, compassion, and solidarity. And faith actors are uniquely well placed to promote those values that are more needed than ever. And I think such actions are particularly compelling if various faith actors join their hands and hearts in an interfaith manner. Let me give you a recent example, I think, of such interfaith support. I found it incredible. A Lutheran church in Berlin has hosted Muslim worshippers who were unable to take part in Friday prayers at their mosque because of social distancing rules. So the imam led prayers in German and Arabic, stressing that the pandemic has brought people together. The church pastor was moved by the Muslim call to prayer in the church, and she said, because it was a she, it's a her, that we have the same concerns and we want to learn from you. And it's beautiful to feel that way about each other. And I would like to emphasize the powerful image of a male imam and a female pastor praying together and acting in solidarity. And also, I think that is very important to fight against, hate speech, anti different religious and anti-migrants and xenophobia. So we discussed this and other examples of mutual cooperation in the COVID-19 context last month during the workshop in Lindau at the first Assembly of Women, Faith and Diplomacy, which Religions for Peace organized extremely well. So all my congratulations, Professor Karam, and probably she's gonna talk about that much more. And I think it truly served as peer-to-peer learning on gender equality, human rights, and the responsibility of faith actors, with each participant sharing their own experiences and bringing in additional perspective and stories. My office has also associated our effort with the Alliance of Civilizations and the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide in order to engage with faith actors through a series of webinars on 6 topics where the role of faith actors is particularly influential. Aligning the efforts of these 3 UN entities in partnership with faith-based actors is particularly important on a specific peer-to-peer learning program. I think it's a major shift from the traditional top-down approaches to a genuine recognition of what faith actors have to offer and what the UN can learn from their action and wisdom. And also, I think it's not just another dialogue. It is based on a specific list of actions by religious actors and faith-based organizations to address the COVID-19 pandemic in collaboration with the United Nations that our respective offices extracted from a global consultation with faith-based actors since last May. I want to use this opportunity to invite all participants to register for the forthcoming series of webinars by the UN Alliance of Civilization, the Office of Genocide Prevention, and my office with religious actors and faith-based organizations. It will start next Monday with a webinar on gender equality and the role of faith actors in achieving it. But you will find the list of the subsequent monthly webinars on the Faithful Rights website of our office. And I think the methodology will be very interactive by sharing good practices and lessons learned concerning gender equality, hate speech, religious sites, minorities, atrocity crimes, and interfaith dialogue. And finally, what else I had an experience in my country because I work a lot with interfaith actors as a president. And also even when I was working on a new constitution, they get together and they propose also, they give a lot of proposals to this new constitution. And they even discuss, and they told me, laughing, that they even discuss about gender equality, like a topic that they never discussed before, but it was a fantastic opportunity. And secondly, I think we have now on this crisis a good opportunity for change. And that is what we have been saying, we need to build back better. We cannot go back to the day zero because that world, it was not an equal world, it was not a just world for the majority of the people. So we need to think what means build back better. And I think faith actors should also provide their perspective, their points of view. I think we need an inclusive economy and we need a greener world and we need to respect nature and so on. But I think it will be very important if faith actors also contribute to this discussion. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. And with these words, it will serve as a good bridge over to Dr. Asa Karam as well, that also received this praise for that conference, Women and Diplomacy. 2 weeks ago, I think you held it.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Eric. And I want to go beyond thanking the ACT Alliance to actually commending the ACT Alliance for this excellent convening, the substantive ways in which the discussion has been organized, and for bringing together some of the most amazing brains out there. So a sincere commendation and of gratitude as well to the ACT Alliance and all the partners and members who are here. It's a great privilege to be able to be with you here today. I am assuming that the same question will apply to me, Eric, and I will try to address it. I just first want to say that one of the most significant initiatives across the UN system that addresses many of the issues that have been raised by Amanda, Abdoulaye Mardier, and others in terms of the nexus between human rights as an international framework of dignity for Earth and people, that particular nexus between human rights and religion is something that Dr. Bachelet enabled through her leadership in UNOHCHR and through the active contributions of and stewardship by Dr. Ibrahim Salama, Dr. Michael Wiener, and Dr. Ahmed Shahid. And I think the Faith for Rights initiative sets and provides an excellent parameter and framework, not only of conceptual, but also of practical engagement that holds, by the way, both the multilateral secular system, as well as the faith-based, faith-inspired realm accountable, each accountable one to the other in terms of not only how human rights are conceptualized, but very much how they are implemented. And there is a synchronicity and a synergistic engagement between the two, where we often find faith leaders and secular leaders sometimes trying to maintain that there is a gap that is irretrievable and one is unnecessary if you have the other. And I think one of the things that UNOHCHR has truly shed light on and provided an active means is precisely how to address that so-called mythical, I think, distinction between faith and human rights. And this is a critical movement for us to be part of and to support and to sustain and to use as a mantra for the engagement that we do. So that is part of the answer to your question, Eric. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're exceedingly good at that. And I wanted to say that I think part of the problem is we assume that by faith engagement, we will be able to resolve situations, because this is the missing link. The missing link, and I am guilty of this kind of argumentation myself. We say the missing link is that we haven't engaged with faith actors. And the truth of the matter is that the nature of the engagement has to be multi-sectoral, as this particular conversation is clearly indicating, but also as the learning from some of the human rights defenders who are at the front lines of so many of these issues, women human rights defenders, those who are working on the basis of their faith and those who are working outside of any faith framework, but from a human rights framework. One of the learnings from that space is it isn't enough to assume that faith-based engagement is the missing link. It is true to a certain extent. It's one of the missing links. But to speak only of faith engagement is to cover up a couple of very critical gaps that we have in faith engagement, about faith engagement, for faith engagement. One of those gaps is the fact that the orthodox policy designs that Abdullah Mardi was speaking of remain very much part of how faith-based actors, especially some of the largest faith-based NGOs, are continuing to operate. We use the same orthodox policy designs that are actually a little bit defunct by now and should have been seriously challenged, as we heard from the previous panel. But we are also guilty of using some of those same orthodox policy designs. We are equally guilty of trying to be territorial in the way that we work together. So the second gap that needs to be addressed in terms of assessing how faith-based engagement makes a difference is, are we actually as faith-based organizations working together? Has COVID forced us to address the moral imperative of multi-faith collaboration, multi-faith service, not only the value of an engagement on the level of discourse, which is huge, it's huge and is manifested repeatedly, and we all serve that, but are we able to pool together our most precious resources, human and financial, to actually serve communities together? And that is a big question. I have at least 2 examples of major initiatives on COVID and for COVID response by different organizations, in which when one organization appeals to the other, when one faith-based organization appeals to another and says, can we work with you, please? The answer is no, thank you, we're doing fine. That is the wrong answer. It is morally, it is financially wrong. And I think we have to be conscious of taking that responsibility. What is it that faith actors have to do different? Not just to point fingers at the secular actors and to assume that we have it right, but to be able to say, are you, to roll off and to others, are you working multi-religiously? Or is it a particular community that you are working with? It's not good enough. Thank you.
It's not good enough. Thank you, Dr. Asa Karam. I see that some of these challenges that you're posing to us as well, we're also guilty of being part of the system. That is something that we can perhaps elaborate a little bit more at the end of this session as well. But I will now give the screen to the Archbishop, Thabo Makgopa, to share with us your perspectives, also being based in Southern Africa, in South Africa, on these particular issues that we have been discussing up till now.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you. Let me also underscore my great appreciation for Rudelma and X Alliance for bringing us together. I come from a particular faith orientation, and the sacred texts within our faith tradition from Proverbs 31 verse 8 says, speak up for those who have no voice, for the rights of all who are destitute. And we know that those that are badly impacted by job losses, by gender-based violence, by lack of service delivery, they do have voices. The challenge is that those voices are not being heard locally and in multilateral platforms. So the role of faith communities is to take what is called the preferential option for the poor. The faith communities have the greatest reach, as everybody has said, into communities, and we tread where very few people dare to tread. In a context of South Africa during COVID, for example, we established what we call the LEANs, that is the local economic ecumenical task networks, maybe in response to the criticism that we also need to learn to work with others. And those local economic networks went into those that were negatively impacted by COVID, and we offered pastoral care, particularly to those that were dying alone in hospitals, and hospitals were overwhelmed by people dying alone. We worked with mobile companies, and we created an opportunity for loved ones via internet to say goodbye to their loved ones. We created creative ways to live stream funerals or to having memorial services. I'm highlighting that to say we can talk at a broader multilateral level, but it is also important to keep our focus on where the rubber hits the road. That is, we need to look at the face of justice. And so most faith-based communities use their venues, they challenge corruption, they look at public theological engagement, they discuss policy, they have these courageous conversations with parliamentarians, with business, and with all sorts of stakeholders. For example, some of the money that the country received for much needed PPEs was stolen by wealthy politicians. And I likened that to very genocidal, because if you steal something that is supposed to give somebody oxygen, you're committing genocide. And so faith communities, as somebody said, we speak truth to power. We've got our warts and all, we've got our challenges, but our main aim is to serve the poorest of the poor, use our facilities, promote advocacy, and ensure agencies, and we mobilize our communities also, so that it is not only us from the pulpit talking. We want to ensure that when we say, let's feed the hungry, we also need to raise the question of why are the hungry without food when some people are dumping food. Let me for now take a pause there, and I'll come back later if there is an opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think this idea about courageous conversations that you have in South Africa, and which you have initiated yourself, is really sort of a multilateral setting where you sit together and discuss with business, governments, and other actors in civil society in building back better in South Africa. And that serves as a very important example. I'm coming back to the High Commissioner Bachelet. You were mentioning empowering grassroots civil society activists are absolutely necessary, and working from top down doesn't work anymore. Yet we are in a situation where we see this global trend of shrinking space for civil society that has increased for many years, and the Civil Society Alliance Civicus calls it a continuing civic space crisis. And at the same time, but maybe not as well known, respect for freedom of religion and belief has faced a sort of a similar negative trend, which has accelerated during the pandemic. So my question, I mean, also what you emphasize, what can we do together, the UN and FBOs, to make sure that limitations on civic space and freedom of religion and belief related to the pandemic are time-bound and will not be there for eternity, because then it will be incredibly difficult for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. So a comment on that, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think this is something that has been concerning us. It is the risk that extraordinary measures that are needed many times to protect the health of the population and to stop the spread of the infection may be unduly extended, if I may say, in some countries. I don't know if you know, but already in April, my office issued a guidance on emergency measures and COVID-19 stressing that such powers should be time-bounded, as you said, and only exercised on a temporary basis with the aim to restore a state of normalcy as soon as possible. But of course, we're talking about freedom that the international human rights law permits to limit, or for some time, freedom of mobility, for example, or freedom of assembly, because you don't want people gathered, but you will never be able to limit some rights like freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Those are non-derogable, which means that Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights cannot be derogated even in times of public emergency, which threatens the life of a nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed. Furthermore, state of emergency legislation and measures should be strictly temporary in scope, should be the least intrusive to achieve the stated public health goals, and include safeguards such as sunset or review clauses, in order to ensure return to ordinary laws as soon as the emergency situation is over. I think that also emergency declarations based on COVID-19 outbreak should not be used as a basis to target particular individuals or groups, including minorities, and of course, human rights defenders or journalists. So measures taken must not involve prohibited discrimination on any grounds, such as religion or other status. So we have been conducting peer-to-peer learning events, notably with civil servants in Nigeria, for example, with faith-based actors in South Asia, and with the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief on students from more than 50 countries. What can we do? I think we have to do a lot of things. We have to speak out. As the Archbishop was saying, we need faith leaders to engage with different stakeholders and of course with governments, and need to speak out on the importance of maintaining those freedoms and the importance of people being able, if, for example, one of the important things for people to I would say, accept that these measures is to have trust in institutions. But if politicians steal the money for PPE, I mean, I don't know how they can trust. So the only way people can trust is that they participate actively, so they can be part of the decisions and they can trust authorities as well. And I think in this thing, faith actors can be very important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Time is almost running out. We have some 4 minutes left, but I would like to have two final comments from Asa and from the Archbishop, please. Also in terms of, as you said, Asa, it's not enough to only speak about faith engagement. You can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, there is there's a moral imperative for multi-religious collaboration to serve communities together. There is a moral imperative for multi-religious collaboration to serve communities together. Let's go beyond discourse into praxis. If and when we work multi-religiously, we simultaneously cut across and destroy the religious fundamentalism, the political fundamentalism, the financial fundamentalism, the secular fundamentalisms. We make it impossible when we collaborate multi-religiously to serve our communities. At the same time, we have to uphold a universal, indivisible, and interdependent human rights agenda. That's what happens when communities collaborate multi-religiously, because multi-religious collaboration requires an agreement, demands an agreement that is based on universal human rights. That is the answer. It has to happen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you for that. And to you, Archbishop, a final word.
Thank you so much. All I could do is, COVID has showed that there are plenty of resources. Please, for God's sake, let us house the homeless. Let us provide health education for those that need it. Let us spread the message that we can, the message of solidarity internationally. Let us feed the hungry. Let us contextualize the message. Just to respond to Asa, I mean, I feel spoiled in South Africa because we tend to take interreligious engagement for granted. Just yesterday, I was in Johannesburg and we were meeting, I mean, all sorts of religious organizations there. And right across the table, the Imam from Cape Town that I didn't see, he says, oh, I can see, there is my Archbishop. We launched the 16 days of activism in his home last week. So maybe we also need to talk about how it is happening in certain places So we belong together, we belong with each other. Let us care for the environment, let us care for the planet, let us respect the woman, let us try and find the face of justice wherever we are sent. So thank you so much, Erika.
Thank you so much to you, Archbishop. And of course, I can understand there are also questions on the Slido, but perhaps we can take them to the group discussions later on for those of you that will participate. That everything will be recorded. It's time to conclude. I would like to thank you, panelists, for all your insights and all the experiences that you have shared with us. And now we will continue into a new segment. And I will ask Rudolmar, I call on Rudolmar to share some information with us.
Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you all the panelists, the 3 sessions. Thank you very much for being with us and to provide this very inspirational, but also forward-looking perspective for our work in the multilateral arena. Now we are finishing this event, the first segment of the event. We will stop our streaming on YouTube, and we will have a 5 minutes break, and then we will enter in groups, bringing together multi-stakeholders from the different sectors to be able to then to go into practical proposals, how we can work collaboratively to address issues related to the COVID-19. Thank you very much, and we will be back in 5 minutes.